Welcome to the 2020 Pilgrim Breakfast. My name is Ann Mason. I am the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. Since 1933, we have been holding an annual Sunday morning breakfast here at the Harlow Old Fort House in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we can't hold an in-person breakfast this year. So for the very first time, we're presenting you with a virtual breakfast. Over the past few weeks, we've been filming a number of short videos that highlight some of our favorite elements of this special day. If you've been to the breakfast every year for 50 years, I hope this virtual program will bring back many happy memories. And if you've never been to the breakfast, then I hope you'll be encouraged and inspired to come next year. Let's begin by taking a look at the origins of this long-standing and much-loved tradition. The Plymouth Antiquarian Society purchased the Harlow Old Fort House in 1920. As Plymouth celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Pilgrim landing, the Antiquarians began a major restoration of this historic home, one of the town's few remaining first-period structures. But the Antiquarians' mission extended beyond the physical preservation of buildings and objects. They were deeply committed to researching and reviving the traditions and skills of everyday domestic life. The Harlow Old Fort House became their primary venue for practicing and teaching the household industries of colonial New England. Here they demonstrated open hearth cooking, spinning, weaving, candle making, and more. They drew national attention and praise for their innovative hands-on approach to understanding the past. On October 1st, 1933, the Society held its first breakfast at the Harlow House. In their report on the year's activities, they noted that it was a delightful event and decided to repeat it annually. By 1949, the Antiquarians had established a schedule of holding 2 breakfasts each year, one on the Sunday closest to the 4th of July, and the other on the Sunday closest to Labor Day. Antiquarian Society members prepared the meal, which costume volunteers served to the public both inside and outside the historic house. In recent years, we've settled on holding just one annual breakfast, on the Sunday closest to the 4th of July. We typically serve 300 guests, welcoming both local residents and out-of-town tourists to experience this one-of-a-kind event. Every year, guests to the Pilgrim Breakfast are greeted by members of the new Plimmoth Gard. Founded in 2012, this local group of historical reenactors portrays the culture and militia of Plymouth Colony from 1621 to the 1640s. Their presence at the Harlow House is especially appropriate, since its first owner, William Harlow, served in the local militia in the second half of the 17th century.
I'm Steve Mattern. I'm captain of the New Plimmoth Gard Reenactor Group. Today we're going to show you the operation of a matchlock musket. What is a matchlock musket? Matchlock musket, as its ignition source, uses a piece of burning cord. This is hemp rope that's been soaked in saltpeter, and when we touch the hot coal on the end of this rope to powder, it burns. Powder in the pan burns, lights up the powder in the barrel, and bang, off goes the musket. So let's walk through the manual of arms, first written by Jacob de Gayen in 1607 in Holland, and almost certainly used by Captain Miles Standish with his militia. So we'll walk through the manual of arms. First, we unshoulder our piece, poise it to separate out the musketeers. We take up the piece. Notice the match cord is safely away from the powder. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to charge our pan. So I will take one of my charging bottles and put some powder into the pan. Then close the pan cover. We'll blow off the loose powder. Next step would be to charge with powder into the barrel for the charge, and then to insert a musket ball. We are not going to use powder or a musket ball today. So although our pan will flash, we will not have any explosion when we fire this. So now we've got after the powder and wadding and ball are in, then we take our scouring stick and we tamp everything down. We place the stick. Now, back to position. Take up our musket. Take up the match in your right hand. Blow the match. Fix it to the serpentine, which, if you can see close up, looks like a serpent's head. Now, we're going to cover our pan. Going to blow on the coal. Little last minute adjustment there. Blow on the coal, and then from there, present, give fire. Again, our pan flashed, but the musket didn't explode. So now you know where the expression flash in the pan comes from.
Hi, my name is Joyce Poremski. I am the lead docent for the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, and I'm also the hostess at our annual Pilgrim Breakfast. And today I have with me my friend,
Faye.
Faye. How old are you, Faye?
7.
7. And Faye started volunteering at our breakfast 3 years ago when she was only 4 years old. Faye, what is your job at the breakfast? Tussie Mussies. Now, Tussie Mussie is a term that most people are probably not familiar with. You may be more familiar with the term nosegay. Nosegay meaning something bright and pleasant for the nose to ward off the odors during medieval times. And then during the Victorian times, Tussie Mussies came into favor. They were a popular gift for a suitor to his lady, and they often held secret messages. The herbs and flowers that they were assembled from were carefully chosen with secret meanings, like a daisy meant childhood innocence, forget-me-nots were undying love, and lily of the valley meant trustworthy, etc. So we are going to assemble one for you today. So first, Faye, what flowers would you like to put into our Tussie Mussie?
I would like
How about a piece of lavender too? Huh? That smells so pretty. And we have a mint. Oh, catmint, yes. You like that? Of course. Okay, so let's put these together. Maybe let's throw in something else too. Of course you have to. Now, Faye, when you get older, what job is it you would like to have?
I would like to have to do cooking. Kitchen.
You want to work in the kitchen cooking the breakfast? That's an important job.
Since I make jam at home. Delicious ones.
So now we're just going to take some floral tape. You could use wire as well if you want it to be a little more secure. But I find the floral tape works quite well. And on a hot day like this, the heat from my hands really melts it and holds it together. You just wrap the stem with some tape. You choose the ribbon you'd like to wrap around this.
I really like this.
As far as the flowers and herbs you put in your Tussie Mussie, that is entirely up to you. We have a wonderful crew of gardeners who usually take flowers that they have blooming in their garden the day of the breakfast. We have some lovely herbs in our garden here as well. You would like to use this? Okay, just gonna cut off some. Oh, this matches your pilgrim costume. Just tie the ribbon around it. Bow. And then we'll take a floral pin and we just put it right in there. Then we have a whole tray of these, and our lovely little Tussie Mussie ladies will walk around and sell them. But I am going to actually pin this one onto you if I can. Stick you. That wouldn't be nice, huh?
Kind of.
It is a little big for you. But there you go. There are our Tussie Mussies.
Now that you know how easy it is to make a Tussie mussie, we hope you'll try making one at home. We're so thankful for the many volunteers who come bright and early on the morning of the Pilgrim Breakfast to make these lovely posies, and we're also grateful to our youngest volunteers who do a great job selling them to our guests. The focal point of any breakfast is, of course, the food itself. Our Pilgrim Breakfast menu has changed very little since the 1930s. It always features fish cakes, baked beans, and cornbread. In 1959, Jane Cooper Baker, who was chair of the Harlow House committee, made sure to post the menu at the entrance so that, as she put it, unsuspecting tourists may be forewarned, as I have met those for whom baked beans and fish cakes were just too great a challenge to their digestions. 1959 was also the year the Antiquarians added cranberry juice to the menu. In recent years, we've started serving scrambled eggs and brown bread, baked by food historian Paula Marcoux.
Brown bread was a staple food here in Plymouth for centuries. Although its form and formula did evolve over all those generations, it had an amazingly long run as a distinctive regional bread. Based on corn and rye meals, it was deeply flavored, solid, filling, and kind of addictive. Eaten by rich and poor alike, brown bread was beloved by locals, but perhaps a bit alarming to outsiders. The version I make in this video represents my notion of brown bread as it may have been made from around 1750 to 1825. The essence of brown bread is flint corn, for centuries the agricultural backbone of Plymouth, and before that of Wampanoag, Patuxet. The grain must first be ground into meal. Plymouth had pounding, or grist mills from the 1630s on, along Town Brook. The remaining ingredients are rye, optionally wheat, a natural leavening culture, salt, and by the 18th century, a smidge of molasses. Yesterday, I mixed the rye meal with a leavening culture to get it working. See the cracks formed in the flour that was sprinkled on the surface as the dough ferments? Using a common practice at the time, I scalded the cornmeal with boiling water and added the salt and molasses. Once all that has cooled down a bit, we're ready to mix it all together. It smells really interesting at this point, as the cidery tang of the rye ferment collides with the savory cornmeal molasses aroma. As I mentioned, molasses became part of the bread's composition probably during the 18th century when Plymouth was deeply engaged in the sugar-based Atlantic economy, making molasses and rum ubiquitous to the region. But the finished bread does not taste at all sweet, rather deep and complex and caramelized. In its heyday, this bread was often made with no wheat at all in it, just the corn and rye that could be grown well locally, and I've been experimenting with reducing the proportion of wheat when I make it. But today I'm ending up using more than I intended because I've already committed too much liquid into the mix to be able to leave it out. It's a pretty wet, loose dough, and when you're making a lot, as I do when the Harlow breakfast is not a virtual affair, it feels a lot more like mixing mortar than any other bread I'm familiar with. I'll let it ferment a while in bulk in a bowl, and then I'll shift it to a cloth-lined basket to rise, which it won't do very much, while I heat up the oven. This outdoor masonry oven, which we built about 5 years ago, functions exactly like the ovens in the Harlow Old Fort House, which is to say, like those built into most every house in New England over the course of many decades. Ovens and bakers, of course, vary, but the dominant principles remain those dictated by the laws of thermodynamics, whichever century you live in. To get ready to bake, you burn a brisk fire over the course of a few hours to thoroughly heat the masonry. Then you clear out the coals and sweep out the ashes, and the residual heat is what bakes your bread, cakes, pies, beans, etc. It felt weird to bake only one lonely loaf of this bread. Typically for the Harlow breakfast, I load that oven full north, south, east, and west. The heavy loaves grow together as they bake, and it's a wrestling match to get them out when the time comes. They bake very differently from most any other sort of bread, given the unique formulation. Essentially, the longer you can leave them in the oven, the better in terms of flavor. Ideally, 3 or 4 hours later, the temperature will have dropped by hundreds of degrees, and the loaves will be deeply browned and smelling irresistible. It's during that long period in the falling heat that the magic happens.
Now that you've seen how much goes into this simple bread, you probably aren't eager to make it at home, but a good case can be made for making its descendant. In the very end of the 19th century, the most common way to make brown bread, now that people didn't have wood-fired ovens in their houses much anymore, they did have cast iron wood-fired cook stoves, which were great for boiling things. So brown bread made a transition from being a yeasted or sour leavened bread like this to being this very similar rye, corn, and wheat, molasses, salt, and some baking soda, a modern ingredient for the 19th century, steamed in a can, or first steamed in a lard pail or any other metal pail that was around, or in crockery too. But I would advocate using the recipe that I will give you to make the brown bread of more recent New England and of my own childhood. It's just as delicious in its own different way, but it's the descendant, the grandchild, the great-grandchild of this bread.
Being surrounded by the laughter and happy conversation of friends and family is one of the joys of the Pilgrim Breakfast. Our wandering singers always add to the good cheer by bringing 17th century tunes and riddles right to your table. And now, our socially distanced Harlow singers will share some of their favorites. Sing along so that you'll be ready to join them next year.
My name is Walter Powell, and I'm acting today as a precentor. During the Pilgrims' worship services, a male, either a tenor or baritone, would line out one of the psalms of David's 150 psalms. Unfortunately, at the time, women were not allowed to lead the singing, so it would be a male voice who would line out line by line each of the stanzas of the psalm, and the congregation would follow. We're going to line out this morning Old 100, a psalm that many of you know, probably best as the doxology used in many Protestant worship services. But the melody is actually quite old. It goes back to the Reformation. It's a French melody, and it was first used in the Genevan Psalter that was developed, or actually published, in the 1560s in Geneva, Switzerland. John Calvin, the great Protestant reformer. So the Pilgrims sang a version of it with a text adapted by a separatist, a man named Henry Ainsworth, who lived in Amsterdam, who was well known to the Pilgrim separatists. And in 1612, he published a book of psalms with tunes to accompany them, 38 melodies, in fact, called Ainsworth's Psalter. So the 1612 Psalter accompanied the Pilgrims here to the New World, and it was their favorite. They continued to use it well into the late 17th, even into the early 18th century. In fact, Longfellow, in his famous poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish, makes reference to Priscilla Mullins having an Ainsworth Psalter on her lap. So there's that tie as well. So Ainsworth Psalter, the 100th Psalm, is the psalm that I'll be lining out. Shout to Jehovah, all the earth.
Shout to Jehovah, all the earth.
Serve ye Jehovah with gladness.
Serve ye Jehovah with gladness.
Before him come with singing mirth.
Before him come with singing
that Jehovah, He God is.
Know that Jehovah, He God is.
It's He that made us and not we.
It's He that made us and not we.
His folk and sheep of His feeding.
His folk and sheep of His feeding.
Oh, with confession enter ye.
Oh, with confession enter ye.
His gates, His courtyard with praising.
His gates, His courtyard with praising.
Confess to Him, bless ye His name.
Confess to Him, bless ye His name.
Because Jehovah, He good is.
Because Jehovah, He good is.
His mercy ever is the same.
His mercy ever is the same.
And His faith unto all ages.
And His faith unto all ages. Hey ho, nobody at home. Eats nor drink, nor money, nor none. Fill the party. Hey ho, nobody at home. Eats nor drink, nor money, nor none. Fill the party. Hey ho, hey ho, nobody at home. Fill the party. Fill the party. Fill the party. Fill the party. Fill the party.
Hello, my name is Leslie Lyman, and I demonstrate weaving here at the Harlow House, and I am currently in what we call the classroom, where we talk about the fiber arts, and weaving was a big part of that. This loom that I demonstrate on is obviously very, very old, and we don't have a date on it, so we don't know how far back it was made. It's obviously very rustic, very handmade. So my guess is that it probably came from the 1800s, because there are metal heddles here on the loom that hold the threads. Now it's possible because back in the early days, they made heddles out of horsehair, and the horsehair heddles eventually would rot and then be replaced with metal. So it's possible that this loom dates back even earlier than the 1800s, but it's a mystery. We don't know for sure. But it's a very simple loom. There are two shafts, or another word would be harnesses, that hold these heddles. So half the heddles are on harness 1 and half the heddles are on harness 2. So half the threads are going through the heddles on harness 1 and half are going through the heddles on harness 2. And then the harnesses are connected to treadles on the floor. So when I push down on a treadle, half my threads go up and make an opening, which we call a shed. Now there are 3 important words to remember: shedding, picking, and beating. Shedding is when you make the shed, or the opening between the 2 layers of your warp threads, so that the shuttle holding the bobbin of thread can go between those 2 layers. So we call that picking. So I put my shuttle through with my thread, And now the third step is the beating. You beat that thread into the fell, or the edge of the fabric. And now I push on the other treadle, which raises the other threads, and that will lock in my weft thread. And it's just, this is called plain weave. It's just a matter of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, the weavers back in the late 1600s, 1700s, they could go very, very fast with plain weave, and that's what they would have used to make as much material as possible. There were itinerant weavers. If you lived in town, there might be a weaver who had a shop, and you could take your spinnings, your hand-spun wool or hand-spun linen to the weaver, and he would make the cloth for you. And he would make plain weave because it was so fast. Or if you had bought land way out in the country and you were farming it and had your sheep, you could then, an itinerant weaver might come to your farm and set up his loom would be on his wagon, and he would set that up in your barn, and he would weave and weave and weave until all your hand-spun fiber was used up. Now, we know that weavers, they have different size looms. There are many different size looms. This is a narrow loom, obviously. There were wide, very wide looms. So the weaver might have his apprentice, they'd have a long bench, and he'd sit on one end and his apprentice would sit on the other, because he couldn't throw the shuttle and grab it himself. It was too wide. So he'd throw the shuttle, his apprentice would grab it at the other end, and then the apprentice would throw it back. And so they could, on these huge looms, they could make coverlets and blankets that were very wide. So it was quite a business. Now, after a while, weaving became mechanized. So you had, like in Lowell, they had these huge factories and these steam-driven looms, and there was an automatic machine that threw the shuttle. You didn't have to throw it, and then threw it back. So gradually, weaving as a cottage craft died because these big industries developed to take over. So luckily, weaving has come back as a craft. And so there are many weavers today who love their craft, and they gather together and learn from each other. And these are some pillows that I have made to put in the gift shop at the Harlow House. And so we have many different designs, because in a two-shaft loom, all you can do is plain weave. But the more shafts or harnesses you add, the more threads can go up and down. And so you can get some pretty intricate designs with your, by raising different threads. So it's a fun craft, a fun hobby to enjoy. So I hope that you'll come to the Harlow House and come visit us in the schoolroom and learn about spinning and weaving.
Thank you for joining us for the 2020 Pilgrim Breakfast. I hope you enjoyed this taste of history and tradition. Many thanks to the talented and creative members of the Antiquarian Society who volunteered their time to make this virtual program possible. I look forward to seeing you in 2021, when hopefully we'll be able to hold this event in person. I'm sure that when we do, the fish cakes will taste delicious, the Tussie mussies will smell sweet, and the joy of being together again will fill the Harlow House yard with much laughter and song.